On this Tasteable Colony History, we're going to create a pie that used to grace every Thanksgiving table in the Old Colony region, and every family had their perfect recipe for it. We're going to bake it, taste it, and see if it deserves a comeback since it's fallen out of fashion. We're talking about Marlborough Pie. For our Marlborough Pie, we need to create a pie crust. For this recipe, you'll need 2½ cups of all-purpose flour, 2 tablespoons granulated sugar, a teaspoon of salt, 18 tablespoons of cold cubed butter, and 6 to 8 tablespoons of ice water. We'll need a large bowl to mix it all in, as well as a pastry cutter or fork, a tablespoon measure and a teaspoon measure, and a 1 cup and ½ cup dry measure. So to begin our pie crust, we're going to measure out 2½ cups of all-purpose flour, next, we need 2 tablespoons of granulated sugar and a teaspoon of salt. And give that a quick whisk to combine. And we're going to start sprinkling the cubes of the chilled butter into the flour. We're going to blend the butter and our flour mixture together with a pastry cutter. Get these pieces fairly small. A wider bowl would have been a good idea here, but so now we've got our butter pieces pretty small. I'm going to start working it with my fingers, just rubbing that butter, working as quickly as possible to really blend the butter in with the flour. I want to get it to the point where the texture looks like cornmeal. Cornmeal-like texture, and our chunks of butter are no larger than beans, which is what we want. So now we'll start incorporating our ice water and mixing this with a fork. So we want 6 tablespoons of ice water sprinkled on top. This to stay as cold as possible, so we are using a fork for this part. It's going to help to mix it all together. This one seems a teeny bit dry, so I'm going to add just another tablespoon of ice water, maybe even less than. Just see if we can get it to come together. Next, we're going to knead this just a little bit. So now we're going to knead the dough. Turn it out onto this lightly floured surface. I'm going to try to work this together before I add the rest of that. My surface apparently was not large enough. You don't want to overmix this, you just want it to get to the point where it's well combined in a cohesive dough, so not so much of this flaking. Still want the butter to stay cold. Help make us a nice flaky pastry crust. Roll this into a ball. Get it as even as we can. And we're going to break this in half. And this will chill for a few hours as we ready our other pie ingredients. Pretty even dough balls. We're going to wrap these in plastic and then store them in the fridge for a few hours. Wrapped one. Our 2 dough balls will hang out and chill for a while. For the filling for our Marlborough pie, we need 6 tablespoons of butter, which will melt. We need the juice of 1 lemon, 3/4 of a cup of stewed pureed apples, 3/4 cup sherry, 1/2 cup heavy cream, 3/4 cup white sugar, 4 eggs, 2 teaspoons grated nutmeg, and 1/2 of the pie crust we made, so 1 of those discs. Here are the tools we need for our pie recipe. We'll need a way to peel and cut our apples, and then a pot to cook them down in, spatula to mix everything together, a few different sizes of measuring cups, a bowl to mix everything in, and of course, our 8-inch pie plate. Our first step for our pie is going to be peeling, slicing, and cooking down our apples to make a stewed apple puree. We're using a mix of apples in this recipe. As you can see, they aren't their most perfect. They have some bruises and they're not the most beautiful, but this was a great way to use up apples that were kind of past their prime. So that's totally okay. And even a little skin isn't gonna hurt us, so we'll leave some on. Didn't have to be perfect. So as you can see, I used a Granny Smith and a Honey Crisp. Well, 2 of each. I'm going to chop these up and add them into my pot. And then we'll add just enough water to cover them. So our apples are covered with water. We're gonna put the cover on and we're gonna bring these up to a boil and then reduce it to a simmer for about 15 to 20 minutes until they're nice and soft. All right, these apples are definitely boiling. Give them a quick stir. Turn that heat down, let them simmer. Set our timer for 15 minutes and we'll check them. Our apples took just under 15 minutes of simmering to get them nice and soft. So I drained them and now they're gonna hang out in the mixing bowl and cool down a bit. Spread them out so they have a little more room to do that. And then we'll start incorporating our other ingredients for our pie filling. So our apples have cooled, measured out 3/4 of a cup of what I made. Since I used 4 fairly good sized apples, I probably made twice what we actually needed for this recipe, so you could use 1 of each type instead. But you do want a mix of different apple flavors, the more tart Granny Smith and the nice sweet crunchy Honey Crisp will work really nicely together in this recipe. So we're gonna mix together our apples, sugar, cream, and the sherry. 3/4 of a cup of apples. We also need 3/4 cup of sherry. Since I'm using a dry measure, we'll go a teeny bit over. 3/4 cup of white sugar, and then 1/2 cup of heavy cream. You can certainly smell that sherry, so we'll mix this all together. Next, we're going to cut and squeeze our lemon juice. Need the juice of a whole lemon. Butter. And then we're gonna beat the eggs. Add the mixture as well. make sure this is really nicely incorporated, all those ingredients. So there's our apple custard. So now we're going to prepare our pie crust and line our pie plate. So take out one of those discs we made. We're only using half the recipe since this type of pie does not have a top crust. So we're going to roll this out. So we used one of the discs of pie crust that we created earlier. This pie only uses half a crust. It does not have a top crust. So I rolled it out and did my best to get it into the pie plate. It's a little rustic. So now we'll add our apple custard filling. Very carefully pour this in. A very full pie crust. I don't know if I rolled it out quite far enough, but we will see. And the final step is to add some nutmeg to the top. I don't have a fresh nutmeg to grind, so I'm just going to sprinkle it along the top with my fingers. Add a nice pretty color as this bakes up and gets nice and golden. I like nutmeg. There we go. All right. So now this goes into a 350-degree oven for about an hour or until a knife comes out clean. So we'll get into the oven and then we'll check on it in just under an hour, see how it's doing. So our Marlborough Pie has been in the oven for about an hour, and take it out and do a test. Oh goodness. Does not look like it's set just yet, but we'll do a knife test and check it out anyway. It's got great color. Actually, probably only needs a couple more minutes. I'm gonna stick it back in, set my timer for 2 or 3 minutes, and we'll take another peek. We're gonna let this cool completely, and then we'll try slicing and tasting. All right, our Marlborough Pie has been cooling, and I'm gonna try giving it a slice and a taste. Let's see how this goes. Cuts nice and easily. Edge caramelized because my pie crust wasn't tall enough. So that might be a problem, we'll see. Very doughy crust. Way too thick, I think. Grab a fork. I don't mind a little doughiness if the flavors are right, so we'll see. It is delicious. You can really taste the sherry. But it's super tasty. It works much better in the pie than on its own because I did try a sip and it was not pleasant. Pie crust, I would say, needs to be about half this thick, so that was my mistake. I am not a pie baker in general, so do yourself a favor. If you aren't either, get a store-bought crust or be super careful and roll it out as thin as you possibly can because it's definitely the mistake I made. This recipe does not require you to pre-bake the pie crust. I probably would have been better off if I had though, so something to keep in mind. But Very tasty, super full of sherry and delicious apple and nutmeg flavor. Smells awesome. I wish you could smell it. But try making your own, learn from my mistakes, and enjoy.